Thanks for everybody who's joining the call. We will be starting in a moment. I will just wait for the attendees to join the call. Thank you everybody for joining this London Climate Action Week event on non-economic losses from climate change, implications for nature, people and COP26. Good morning, I'm Colin McQuiston and I'm the Head of Climate and Resilience and Practical Action, and I'm really pleased to be introducing this event co-hosted with WWF and 6 Degrees, which is a voluntary student organisation for students from Oxford and Durham University who will be co-hosting the session today. We will be speaking for approximately 45 minutes with presentations from the panelists today. During the presentations, I would appreciate if people would be, you type your questions in the Q&A box, which is will appear at the bottom of the screen. And we will collect those questions and answers and then use them to feed the Q&A discussion at the end of the session. So as I mentioned, we have a number of panelists from various organizations talking about non-economic losses from climate change today. We will be starting with a general overview of non-economic losses within the COP26 negotiating framework. And then we will move into a comparative study of non-economic losses from a similar event that occurs in both a developed and a developing country context, and really looking at how existing practices around non-economic loss and damage influences some of the decisions that we're taking. We then have 3 specific presentations delving deeper into the social, biological and human aspects of non-economic losses. We have a presentation from flood-prone communities in Bangladesh. We have a presentation for indigenous peoples in the Himalayas. And finally, a presentation around how non-economic losses plays out in small island developing states. So why are we talking about non-economic losses? Well, it's clear that climate impacts are escalating, and looking at a newspaper this morning, the heat stress in North America is having a huge impact on human lives, and the death toll, or the hospital admissions and the death toll from heat stroke in Canada has risen phenomenally over the last couple of days as a result of that heat. But that heat is not only impacting people, it's also impacting ecosystems, it's impacting the way people live, it's limiting what people can do for occupations. So we're really interested in exploring what those non-economic impacts of the climate disasters are. We know that climate change is exacerbating poverty and it's leading to these biodiversity crises, but we need to be thinking about it in a very holistic way, not just the economic costs, but also the non-economic costs. Non-economic costs, we know, are not easy to record. They're not easy to quantify, and therefore they're difficult to compare and contrast across different scenarios. They can impact the individual. For example, loss of mobility. In a heat wave, you can't work outside, you can't work during the day. Society loss. We're talking about sea level rise, inundating areas of small islands, taking away traditional burial sites, for example. So we're losing cultural heritage, and we're also losing the environmental costs. We're losing coral reefs, we're losing critical ecosystems, we're losing habitats that not only have human use values, but also aesthetic and biological values. So the non-economic loss sphere has been part of the climate negotiations for quite a while, and was really brought to the fore with the agreement to establish the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage in 2013. And based upon that establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism and the identification of the priority areas for the Warsaw International Mechanism to focus on, non-economic losses was one of the things that came out as a priority. That was a priority in the initial 2-year rolling work plan and was subsequently taken forward into the 5-year rolling work plan. So why are non-economic losses important? They're important because they're all too often overlooked. And we need to shift the spotlight onto non-economic losses as we think about the preparations for Glasgow for COP26. We need to do that because we know that nature-based solutions are very much the flavor of the moment. And we want to make sure that any consideration of nature-based solutions, any actions to support a nature-based adaptive approach to climate impact thinks about non-economic valuation. It's not just about nature-based solutions, it's about nature-based solutions that work for people, for the environment, for the planet. So with that basic introduction, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Sandeep Chamlang-Rai. He is the Senior Advisor on Global Climate Adaptation Policy at WWF International Climate Energy Programme based in the Singapore office. He leads WWF's global efforts on climate change adaptation and loss and damage policy and practice. Sandeep has participated in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process, in various capacities, both with WWF and also with the Nepalese government. He is one of the members of the NELS, Non-Economic Losses Expert Group under the Warsaw International Mechanism. So please, handing over to Sandeep for your presentation.
Thank you, Colin, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. So let me share my slide. As Colin mentioned, I will talk about the non-economic losses as in the climate change. Non-economic loss from climate change and its implication for nature and people in the UNFCCC context. So, well, Colin has briefly mentioned about the economic and non-economic loss. So I will also quickly turn into that. But before talking about the economic loss and non-economic loss, I think we need to first understand what's the loss and damage in the UNFCCC context. So when you look at the UNFCCC context, there is no agreed definition of loss and damage, but loss and damage can be argued as the impacts of climate change due to insufficient effort to reduce greenhouse gas emission and inadequate adaptation action. And the loss and damage happens in both the economic terms, where we can really quantify the monetary value, and the non-economic terms, where we cannot really quantify in terms of economic value, or those are not commonly traded in the market. And the non-economic loss, we talk about the individual level. We talk about the loss of life, loss of health, and loss of human mobility, which is we can completely understand. The loss of society in terms of the loss of territory, loss of cultural heritage, a lot of indigenous knowledge, or a cultural identity. So that's on the society. But on the foremost side is also loss of in the environment, there's a loss of biodiversity, a loss of ecosystem services, and loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services are really undermined in the whole, let's say, the climate debate. So if you look about the biodiversity loss, WWF produced this Living Planet report on a periodic basis, and we have been seeing that almost 40 to 50% of the biodiversity loss is there, and some of those losses are really attributed by climate change. And one of our, I would say, analysis, what we also produced in our Living Planet report 2020, is that by this century, almost 1/5 of the world biodiversity will be lost due to climate-related impacts. So the loss of biodiversity is really prominent. Then that has been really undermined. And the other component is about loss of ecosystem services. When you look about the glaciers ecosystem, or when we talk about the let's say coastal ecosystem, about let's say mangroves, coral reef ecosystem, those are being really lost due to climate change, due to ocean acidification, due to extreme heat, extreme weather patterns, and also temperature rise. So those things have not been really, they came in the forefront discussion of the loss and damage, and those aspects are considered under the non-economic loss, which also need to be really highlighted into the debate. So let me quickly talk in terms of the different timeline of the non-economic loss. So like the Warsaw International Mechanism, which was established in 2013, and in 2014 in the Lima Cup, the initial 2-year work program was established, and out of that, the non-economic loss was action agenda item number 4. And moving to the Paris Agreement has really anchored the loss and damage within the Paris Agreement, and under the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, Article 8 para 4G, the non-economic loss has been highlighted over there. And in 2016, in the 5-year rolling work program from 2018 to 2022 on the NEL, on the non-economic losses has been outlined as a work stream 2. And what are some of the key strategic, I would say, outlook of these non-economic losses has been highlighted in 2017. But it really took time, because it's not only about the nail, there are also other various issues that needs to be looked within the loss and damage space. So last year in October 2020, the TOR of the non-economic loss expert group has been finalized, and the first expert group has been formed, and the meeting has took place in earlier March this year, and the rolling plan of action has been developed as of May 2021 by the non-economic loss expert group on how to take this agenda forward. So in terms of non-expert group, it was the TOR finalized in October 2020. You can see, you can download from here. There are 19 members. There are the 4 executive committee members. There are technical expert and also representative from a various constitution bodies. Like I represent from the NGO sector. We have a younger group, but we also have a research organization and research universities and others. The first meeting of this NEL expert group takes place earlier March, and they developed 2-year rolling work program, which really highlights some of the key area how to take this issue forward. But I also want to highlight the NEL expert group is a technical arm of the Warsaw International Mechanism. If we see this on the right hand side, there are other technical arm of the I would say arm of the expert group, which talking about task force on displacement, we're talking about the technical expert group on comprehensive risk management, and there are expert group like slow onset event and excellent support. So, but the whole aspect of this technical arm is to execute the thematic work that has been prioritized by the XCOM, and also plays an advisory role to the XCOM. And this technical body is not the arm for the implementation part. So I will quickly go in terms of what are some of the plan of action the expert group has highlighted that will carried out from year 2021 to up to 2022, because the time duration for the expert group is for 2 years. So there are 3 key areas the expert group will be work on. Firstly, on the stock taking of the relevant data, tools, and knowledge. So the expert group will really try to collect information of data and tools for accessing the NEL and update the technical paper on NEL that was published in 2013, almost 7-8 years ago. And there is a program to produce a synthesized product on 2 lesson learned and the good practices and the information gaps for assessing NEL at the national level. That's on the stock taking. Second thing is more about awareness raising, outreach, and support strategy, where the NEL expert group is really working on where there will be a targeted outreach and awareness raising material that will be tailored to a different stakeholders from the global level to regional, sub-national, and the local level. But on top of that, the NEL expert group also to map the potential partners who are active on the NEL work, and also engage them with the relevant activities and plan of action. And also scope and prioritize various regional and national events, and mobilize partners to collaborate with the NEL expert group to use those events to identify and address and support needs for the developing country on addressing their NELs. And the third one, which is also really relevant and really important, is about enhancing technical guidance and catalyzing support. This is also one of the area where the NEL expert group will work on. The first key work they will the NEL expert group will do is work jointly with the Task Force of Displacement, TDF, to outline guidelines on averting, minimizing, and addressing NEL in the context of human mobility. But beyond that, there are 4 key, I would say, technical guidance the NEL expert group gonna produce. The first one is on the NEL consideration at the national level comprehensive risk management framework. Second, on human mobility impacts on indigenous or local knowledge, societal identity, and cultural heritage. The third product is on addressing loss associated with the ecosystem, biodiversity, and health nexus from global to local level. And fourth one is on addressing losses associated with the loss of territory, ecosystem services, and cultural heritage nexus. And in the end, the expert group will provide some recommendation to the outcome for the consideration of the parties for the 2022 COP. So in nutshell, what I would say, non-economic losses are happening everywhere in every part of the world. Like Colin said, we are seeing right now in North America in terms of extreme heat wave, but also much more primarily on the small and developing states, LDCs, and the African country. Non-economic losses, the NEL issues within the loss and damage is very less visible compared to the economic losses, because economic losses can be quantified, whereas non-economic loss cannot be. And the NEL expert group is more like technical arm, not an implementing arm. But there is a lot of NEL assessment need to be done at the country level, especially from the cultural knowledge, indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, and the ecosystem services. But there is also a technical capacity and finance constraint. And these are the challenges that need to be addressed for the NEL. And COP26 also really needs to acknowledge the NEL issue from climate change and needs to take bold decision on how to support and address NEL issues at the national and local level. So let me stop there, and happy to come back later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, for your excellent clarification of the UNFCCC framing of non-economic losses, including an overview of its evolution under the negotiations from 2030. It's really clear that the attribution of biodiversity losses is increasing. Those biodiversity losses, of course, have implications for ecosystem services. So it is paramount that the UNFCCC under the negotiations is thinking about this. And I think some of the challenges you highlighted are the scale of the problem, the technical constraints that we face, understanding and therefore developing plans to respond to the problem, and a priority for the COP to consider how to support NELs going forward. So that's a very good segue into the next presentation, which is by a couple of students from 6 Degrees. We have Quincy Childs, and Quincy is reading for a master's in Nature, Society and Environmental Governance at the University of Oxford. And she's exploring the combination of critical theories of political ecology and policymaking. Quincy is a member of a diverse team of volunteer researchers with 6 Degrees, exploring how to use a multidisciplinary approach in the value of non-economic loss and damage for frontline climate impacted communities. A study that bridges the fields of ecosystem services and climate justice. And she's going to be presenting in a tag team with Sari Asada. Sari is a Canadian Memorial Foundation and Rotary Scholar reading for a Master's in Environmental Change and Management at the University of Oxford. Sari is keen on learning more about non-economic loss and damage and the importance of incorporating climate justice into inclusive policymaking processes. So I would like to hand over to Sari and Quincy for your presentation, please.
Thanks, Colin, and thank you for everybody for being on this webinar. My name is Sari Osada, and I'm here with the honor of representing 6 Degrees Oxford with the collaboration of Durham University. And our team was composed of 6 student volunteer researchers alongside 2 student consultants. And over the period of 6 months, we were able to collect some of the literature available around the comparative study of non-economic loss in a high to low to middle income country context.
In sharing the premise of this report, practical action brought to our attention the myopic scope of current climate policies, wherein the focus on loss and damage often aligns with path 1, when resources are valued according to narrow economic terms. As a result of this oversight, what often escapes from view are the losses and damages to non-financially quantifiable resources and ecosystems. This means that diverse ecological, cultural, and intrinsic values of ecosystems that are important for human livelihoods go undervalued. The primary task for our research team was therefore to devise a metric system that responds to path 2, to elevate new values that express resources in their natural metrics. We summarize this framework under the rubric of non-economic loss, or NEL. This report provides an overview of the challenges and opportunities of valuing NEL by looking at 2 case studies, one in the USA and the other in Bangladesh. It draws broadly on existing literature, focused specifically on biodiversity loss in mangrove ecosystems, and presents key highlights based on best practices going forward. Our report also reflects our interdisciplinary knowledge as 6 Degrees research fellows as we synthesized our diverse ways of approaching this complex issue.
So here's just a snapshot comparison to illustrate what it might mean for an event to strike a high income country as versus a low to middle income country. So the 2 case studies we're looking at is the 2005 Hurricane Katrina, and then the other one is a 2007 Cyclone Sidr that affected the Sundarban mangroves in Bangladesh. The reason why we chose these 2 cases is that they were the ones that had the most data that was available for our research aim. So very simply, what we can see from this table is that the physical impacts of both events are quite similar. We're looking between a category 5 hurricane versus a category 4 cyclone. But when you actually look more into the details, the number of lives lost in Bangladesh is pretty much double. And more strikingly, it's the economic valuation and a lack of non-economic valuation involved in both of the cases. So you look at the US, where shrimp farming is one of the biggest industries in Louisiana. And from looking at government reports, you can see that the range, there's a huge discrepancy, but it's in the millions and billions as compared to Bangladesh, whose fishing industry is perhaps not all commercialized, but based on small scale artisanal family-based fishing, which might not be easily evaluated using a very typical standard economic valuation format. So in looking between these 2 case studies, you can see that at the very bottom, at the very end of the day, you could have a lot of valuation covering high-income countries that have the capacity to calculate these losses, whereas for places like Bangladesh, very little.
So a key takeaway for us was a caveat, namely that existing frameworks for assessment are rooted in economic theories of value. In addition to this, the very task of devising a universal quantification framework contradicts the complex nuances of ecosystem multiplicity. Ecosystems are, of course, always distinctly unique in their interrelated characteristics and properties. Therefore, the task to develop a single metric system for evaluating NEL in different ecosystems seems untenable. And finally, we also wish to highlight limitations that are shaped by present assessment flaws established by official regulatory bodies. For example, we recommend departing from the UN practice in which external technical experts are hired to aggregate loss through economic valuation methods of risk indices and quantitative assessments alone. Instead, we suggest a well-designed management framework that puts forward local and global public benefits. This means that any regulative system requires as much variety in the actions as there is in the system to be regulated, with awareness of the social values at stake in every assessment.
So while being really far from perfect, here is at least one way to start the conversation, an action for how to value non-economic loss, especially for ecosystem services, which our report focuses on. So a step-by-step number one is to look at the policy. What kind of policies exist? Is there any kind of mechanisms that look at the non-economic side of the whole calculation being done? Step two, which is very important, is engage the stakeholders involved on the ground. As I mentioned earlier, the culture, the heritage, and the practices around certain industries that drives the economy of the country can be really different depending on which country context we're looking at. So it's really important to engage the locals throughout this process, which leads to number three, identifying and quantifying of ecosystem services. So there is quite a lot of literature out there already having different approaches to doing it. And it's really a matter of catering to the local needs and what the research is saying. There has to be some kind of match in terms of that process, which then leads us to number four, the actual valuation process. So recognizing that certain values just can't be quantified monetarily. This includes lives, that includes cultural heritage, and all the other points the speakers before have outlined. And after that, with this value, we can identify the source of the loss and damage. And this is just to see how can we ensure that when future events occur, what can be done to ensure that there is minimal loss and damage involved to prevent future damages. And then finally, the point of number six, estimating the extent to which ecosystems were lost or damaged, taking into account how they regenerate. So this is, again, a very new area which needs definitely more attention, and looking between a high income and low to middle income country context, the capacity is just lacking so much in the low and middle income side. So there needs to be more attention with that, and also the potential for ecosystem services to thrive and using nature-based solutions. And I think there's so much hope and also so much drive and push that we need in this conversation. So basically, we want to give you 4 key takeaways. So number one, it's really clear. There's critical disparities between different countries depending on their income levels. And one of the reasons include the lack of data management around disasters, but also the capacity to know what kind of valuation methods to use and to engage stakeholders. This requires a lot of climate finance. And number two, economic valuation methods entail inherent value judgments, which again might not be really appropriate for a certain country context. So it has to be catered, it has to be place-based, and it has to engage people on the ground who are seeing these realities to take action on this, which leads to number three, there just needs to be more meaningful participatory approaches. So with the literature that we scanned across, most of it has been just pure economic calculations and not much of the community voice. And I think that's very important when we're kind of coming into this conversation. And then finally, there are just so many opportunities for diverse stakeholders and policymakers to collaborate here at the London Climate Action Week and the upcoming COP26. There is a real need for a new, separate, and additional finance, a climate finance mechanism to ensure that loss and damage are accounted for. And we definitely need that voice for these low and middle income countries that perhaps don't have the capacity, but have the knowledge and have the action to push this straight forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sari and Quincy. And a quick reminder to our audience today, please do keep your questions coming. We've got some great questions already in the Q&A box, but please do keep your questions coming. So thank you for that presentation. I think it was really interesting to have that comparative example of a similar event striking a developed and a developing country. And particularly the fact that you adapted the study given the limitations on data access during a pandemic, and had to really build it around 2 areas where there was plentiful access to existing data. I think the stark differences you highlighted with the fishing industry, the shrimp in Louisiana versus the subsistence fishing in Bangladesh, and of course the implications that has. One is bankruptcy of economic concerns, the other is providing food for people on their plates on a daily basis. I appreciated the suggestions of the shift around moving away from external experts and risk indices and moving to a greater reliance on local systems, which is a great segue into our next presenter. I think your suggestions for looking at the policy, looking at stakeholder engagement and how to capture cultural values are all really valuable. And in particular, thinking about ecosystem regeneration, which really links very well with the whole idea around nature-based solutions. We know this is going to be a priority for COP26. So what can we do? How can we shape that discussion in the next 5 months? It is now my great pleasure to introduce Pasang Dolma Sherpa. Pasang serves the Centre for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, CIPRED, as the Executive Director, and has been working with Indigenous peoples of Nepal in relation to climate change education, particularly in the area of Indigenous peoples' customary practices and traditional knowledge in conservation and sustainable management of natural resources and biodiversity. She is the co-chair of the IUCN Specialist Group on Indigenous Peoples, Customary Environmental Law and Human Rights, and a working group member of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform of the UNFCCC. So if I can invite Pasang to put your video on and give your presentation to our audience today. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, and also thank you for all the excellent presentation earlier that I was on the important subject of our discussion today. As you have highlighted that nature-based solution as a part of the discussion in the UNFCCC as well as in CBD and other UN bodies and also other different multilateral and bilateral agencies focus on nature-based solution to deal with the climate change. As I was given to share a little bit more experience on the ground, how indigenous peoples have been contributing for nature-based solution or also contributing for climate change resilience. Let me share a little bit, give a little bit backgrounds, and before I come to some concrete studies or concrete examples of how indigenous peoples, their cultural and knowledge system have contributed for climate change resilience. As we all are aware that indigenous peoples are the stewardship to the biodiversity, nature resources, and ecosystem that has already come up with a different study and research so far. However, indigenous people are forefront to the impacts of climate change. The situation of indigenous peoples in comparison to the non-indigenous peoples, who are living close to the nature, close to the forest, close to the river. So the impacts is more higher due to the impacts of the climate change. Like, for example, as we all have heard about the context of Nepal, the floods and the landslides, even the glacier melts and ice, melting ice in the Himalaya. So there are severe replications on the ground. So, however, now we have seen the impacts of climate change more kind of physical impacts. However, the spiritual, the cultural, the social impacts are hardly considered in the discourse of climate change. I believe this is one of the examples that we are talking about non-economic losses. The non-economic losses neither has been highlighted in the climate discourse at the national or the local or even the global level, nor come up with the relevant policies and the policies and the actions on the ground. So as I was already sharing earlier, that a different study, including the ICBASE or ICBASE, World Bank or IUCN, IPMG or different study already come up with the fact that 6.2% of indigenous peoples population around the world have already contributed for more than 80% of the biodiversity conservation. From this study already comes to the fact that indigenous peoples' knowledge system, cultural values, and spiritual values have really contributed for climate change resilience. The IPCC report 2019 also talked about the indigenous people and local agricultural practices as being the very prominent for addressing the climate change, dealing with the impacts of climate change, and also securing the sustaining the natural resources. So despite the fact that a different study, including the IPCC or including ICBASE, talks about the important role and contribution of indigenous people for addressing the climate change resilience. However, if you see on the local ground, on the practices, we hardly see the engagements, or we hardly see the role and contribution of indigenous people to be reflected in the policy and practices. This I do not blame to anyone, but I blame the trend of education that we are brought up. Our education system have brought up in such a way that Western values, modern values, capitalistic worldview are higher, superior than in comparison to the worldviews of the indigenous people. Consequently, in Nepal or any part of the world now, indigenous people are continuously suffering despite contributing to the climate change resilience, but still vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and despite being contributing to the spiritual and cultural and social values for resilience of the climate change, still they are away from the discourse of the climate change, especially in the developing policy and programs. So now I would like to share a little bit examples of how indigenous people have been contributing through their practices. Like, for example, in Nepal, 60 indigenous people, one is added recently. So in 60 indigenous peoples, we have our own customary governance system. We have our own customary institution. So the institution have our own customary governance system that contributed for the management of the natural resources, water, forests, or species, ecosystem, biodiversity, through the worshipping the nature, like trees, big caves, big river, is a part of the traditional and the cultural practices. And for example, Chepang is one of the indigenous groups in Nepal that who are still depending on their livelihoods and natural resources, living in the forests. So when they collect their underground fruit like Gitiad Bakur, they just worship first and take the permission to collect the food, and then they remain, and then they collect only they need it, and they leave the remaining for the next year. Similarly, if you see like 18 different indigenous groups in Nepal, especially living in the mountain region, they have their own customary institution. As I said, like Sherpas, Lama, Nishangba, Mitheva, there are so many indigenous groups. They have their own customary institution, worshipping the nature. For them, nature is their pride. For them, nature is their identity and culture, spiritual value. They are symbiotically related with each other. So, traditional healing practices, for example, like when they collect the herbal medicine, they collect only what they needed, and they remain the small one for to be grown up for the next year to be collected. Shakya customary institution is another institution in Nepal in Gorkha district. The customary institution with the self-governance system is so strong, based in the non-violence principle, restriction prohibited from killing wild animals or even domestic animals, poaching and selling both domestic and wild animals are completely forbidden. Even honey hunting and forest fire is completely prohibited. So from this, our customary governance system already clearly talks about how they are embedded with the nature. And in fact, now the discourse of the climate change, now the UNCCC and CBD, even the different agencies, including IUCN, talks about the nature-based solution as a solution to impacts of climate change. But it is very, very sad to see like if still within this nature-based solution, the indigenous people's role and contributions, still need to be highlighted. The right-based solution, right-based indigenous people's way of managing the natural resources are still to be addressed in the nature-based solution, because nature-based solution is a right-based solution of indigenous people. So the way of indigenous people dealing with the nature is already proven that is a nature-based solution. So we do not need to seek the solution outsiders, but we need to seek solution within ourselves, because indigenous people's solution is already proven that it is more nature friendly and embedded with the nature. So I just give you another few examples, like in current community in Thailand, they also talk about like if you drink water, you have to save. They have similar proverbs. If you use the forest, then you have to protect the forest. So this kind of different proverbs are there. So another part is very important part is the Ambigual Court. When the children are born, they are tied into the bamboo and then put in the tied in the tree. So that tree symbolically represent the soul of the persons whose umbilical cord is being tied. So in the indigenous peoples like Karen in Thailand, or as well as in Kirat or Tharu indigenous groups in Nepal, that more the children are grown up, more forest is there. So this also already shows that how the indigenous practices, knowledge, and our traditional is so contributing for nature-based solution, and also for climate change resilience, both adaptation and mitigation. With this one, I do not have more to say, but only would highlight that the efforts are already been started in UNCCC to acknowledge the indigenous people's knowledge system as a discourse of learning from each other. That started in COP21 in 2015 in Paris. Now in the span of couple of years, we have already have 14 members of the FWG, 7 from indigenous people socio-cultural region, and 7 from the government state, to work on the 3 purposes of the platform: local communities and indigenous people platform, knowledge, capacity building, climate change policy and action. The knowledge here refers to the indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, how we can learn each other so that we can build a capacity for having the climate change policy and action. And finally, I would like to highlight that the RRA research recently come up with the fact that now whole negotiation is going towards the market-based initiatives. And more on carbon trading, in the absence of the rights and safeguards of the indigenous people for continuing playing the important role and contribution for indigenous peoples for climate change resilience. So with this one, I would like to stop, and if there's any queries and suggestions, I would be more than happy to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pasang. That was a really interesting presentation, particularly highlighting the role of the global process, UNFCCC, UNCBD. You also mentioned IPBES, the World Bank, IUCN, etc. But I think that point that you highlighted, that 80% of biodiversity conservation is the contribution of less than 6.2% of indigenous peoples on the planet, is something that we need to remind people of. That the culture and the values is critical to this conservation process, highlighting several traditional agricultural practice and traditional cultural practices which support biodiversity conservation and support adaptation and mitigation to climate change. I think your call for a shift of worldviews is crucial. Education, we need to move away from that economic focus, and then particularly you're highlighting that indigenous solutions are nature-based solutions. We know that at COP26, there's going to be a lot of talk about nature-based solutions. Who is going to be in the room, and what is the metric against which those nature-based solutions are going to be judged as being effective, successful, and which ones are going to attract the investment? And I think your call for it not to be the market-based and carbon trading based solutions, but the genuine indigenous solutions that really provide a long-term solution is very timely. And certainly, I'm sure we'll get plenty of questions and discussion on this later in the presentation. It's now my pleasure to move to Afsari Begum. Afsari Begum is the Senior Advisor for Disaster Risk Reduction with Practical Action in Bangladesh, and it's been a pleasure to work with Afsari for many years. She has experience in development, particularly in agriculture and building resilience in climate impacted communities in Bangladesh. Afsari has an MBA in Marketing and Finance and has just completed a master's degree on climate change and development. Afsari is currently the project manager for the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance program in Bangladesh and will share her experiences directly from this program. And apologies everybody, because of bandwidth issues, I will be sharing Afsari's presentation. So please bear one moment as I get this on the screen. And I hope you can all see that now. Can I just get a confirmation?
Yes, thank you, Colin.
Yes.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
And please remind me to change the slides, Asari.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Colin has already introduced me, so I'm not going to introduce myself. I'm just going straight to my talk. Today, I have brought the cases, basically the human stories that has been facing by the communities, especially the people who are living in the chore areas, and due to the climate change, how they are impacting by the non-economic loss and damage. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So over the years, Bangladesh has made significant progress in both social and economic development. A huge investment is being made to deal with the negative impact of the climate change and to deal with the climate action. Despite all these efforts, communities who are in it, and it is causing tremendous losses and damages almost every year. And these people lack resources and capacity to deal with such consequences. Besides the economic losses, communities also are experiencing non-economic losses and damages. These non-economic losses often go unnoticed, although they have a severe impact on human life. When I meet people, they talk about the emotional and personal strain that climate change has on them, as much or more than the economic impact. For these people to remain strong means they have to deal with such losses. Very recently, I met with ladies named Champa, Josna, Anwara. They are just some of the people facing losses due to the climate stress. The cases are from the chore areas of the Faridpur districts. These people and many generations before them have lived in the chore lands. Let me tell you that chore refers to floodplain sediment islands. And these people stories are saying their feeling of being displaced by river erosion and feelings of belonging somewhere else, possessing a different life. So here you are seeing the voices of Chompa. Every year, these people have to face the flooding and river erosion. With the passage of time, the intensity and frequency of flood is increasing, lasting for the longer period. The river erosion is becoming more severe and intense. We have experienced the same thing in the year 2020 when we faced, these communities basically faced the worst flooding of the decade, and at the same time they had faced the COVID pandemic and then cyclone Amphan. So Champa, Josna, Anwara, they all are living in the Faridpur Chor, and they are living there for more than 25 years. They changed their housing location for more than 12 times due to river erosion. Once they had their own land for cultivation, residents to live without any fear, life was easy and sufferings were also less. But slowly, things have changed. Their land, houses are now underwater due to erosion. Their own school, playground, madrasa, mosque, nothing is left to touch and feel. So Champa, she is living in Dikri Chor, as I said, for like more than 20 years. And she also displaced for like 12 times. When I talked with her, she said that when I remember our old days, our home, school, playground, agricultural land, I cannot think of anything. I do not understand. I cannot feel. Where am I? Am I in this world or somewhere else? Those were our golden days. Very different from now. This is how she expressed her feeling of being displaced. And really, I didn't have any words to actually say anything to her. Now we're moving on to the next voices of Anwara. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. As I said that these people are living uh, on other people's land. They are paying rent annually, and managing rent is another difficult issue as income opportunity for these families has decreased as they now don't have their own land. They work as a day laborer, and the loss of their land, they no longer engage in profitable agricultural activities. Even when they're working in other people's land, for the groundnut production, because this the soil texture is suitable for the groundnut production in the chore areas. Early monsoon season, prolonged flooding, and sometimes outbreak of diseases devastates their crops. And Anwar Begum, she said, our expenditure to adapt with this situation is too high than our earning. We are managing this by taking loan. Household peace are also at stake, especially in time when we lack money to meet our daily basic needs. Critical health conditions end up putting the family in debt. How would we run if we don't have the income opportunities, if the income opportunities has been seized? The another story of Josna. Can we move on to next slide, please? Yes. She said that we never had to buy fruits from markets because now it's the season that we are getting the summer fruits, for example, mangoes, then jackfruits and all other fruits. This is the time when we really enjoy the fruits. So like out of frustration, out of sadness, she was saying that we never had to buy fruits from market. And now we don't have trees, nor do we have money to buy fruits. As we are living on other people's land, we don't have freedom to do things in our own way. Once we had so many fruit trees, and now we have no place for plantation. The impact of their loss to identify identity and belonging outweighs any sense of economic loss. The continuous erosion of a river now very close to our home, she was saying, and we are taking preparation to move to some other place. And when she was talking this, she was literally crying, thinking how we would manage, what we would do to continue our life, children's education. It seems everything is being shattered and I'm becoming sick thinking all this. I'm scattered to move to new place. Feeling bad to leave this place. So this was damage resulting from the climate change impact. And that's not to say that their economic hardship is not severe. From time to time, their critical health conditions end up putting the family in debt, as they said. As they said that their expenditure to adapt with the situation is greater than their earning. They're managing this by taking loan, household peace at stake. They told me that they are constantly moving from one place to another in the same chore. But why? Despite all these difficulties, we don't feel to move to another place. We know this place. People of this place know us. They know our children. We share a social bondage. It gives us comfort and the skills that we have. We can work here only. We do not have enough to resettle somewhere else. What will we do to go another place? How would we manage? Thinking of these are extremely difficult for us. So here, impacting these people. These are issues that the government of Bangladesh has to deal with at a colossal scale. And as the sea level continues to rise, more people are displacing and more will be displaced in future. This is a problem of global proportions, and we should expect the people least responsible for the problem in the first place to be paying the higher price. This is why we need the global community to come together and help these people. We need a global fund to finance actions to address loss and damage. And we need to urgently decarbonize the global economy. But most of all, we need to help the people who are already paying a high price. And in my last slide, I just want to say, can I move on to the last slide, please? Colin, can we move on to the next slide, please? Just want to say, stop saying that it is hard to measure these in monetary terms, these non-economic losses, but I can assure you that they are equally as important as economic loss and damage. I'm stopping here. Thank you all for hearing me and hearing the voices of the community. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Afzari, for a very interesting presentation of the situation of the communities in coastal Bangladesh. I think it's really important that we hear those stories of people facing the impacts of the climate emergency. You clearly outlined the progress in social and economic development and innovation that the government of Bangladesh has done around its climate change policies and plans, its climate change trust fund, etc., etc. But I think clearly the scale of the challenge that the country, the people face, and the resources they've got available is very mismatched. But that wasn't always the case, and you don't have to go back that far for those people's stories to have been very different. And as a result, they have a sense of a loss of belonging, a feeling of impermanence, and of course, big concerns about the future. But also that the changing environment is having impact on traditional cropping practices. I think your final slide, highlighting the scale of the problem in Bangladesh, the needs for global solidarity, a global loss and damage fund to compensate people for the losses that they're facing, is of paramount importance. So thank you very much, Afsari. And I apologize to everybody for the sound problems that may have occurred during that presentation. It's now a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Linda Siegel, who is an environmental lawyer based in the UK. She has been involved in the United Nations climate change negotiating process since 2005, with a special focus on the issues of adaptation and loss and damage. Linda is particularly familiar with the climate change concerns of small island developing states and least developed countries, having directly supported country delegations through the provision of relevant technical and strategic policy advice. So Linda, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. First of all, just a quick sound check. I hope everyone can hear me. I would like to thank Practical Action, WWF International, and the organizers of the London Climate Action Week for inviting me to be part of this really amazing panel of individuals. And as the last sort of substantive presentation, I believe my presentation can only piggyback on the richness of those presentations that came before mine. And I hope that I can pull out some of the strings in respect of what's come before as they relate to small island developing states. I just want to be very clear that I'm here in my personal capacity as an academic lawyer based in the UK, and that while the flyer for this program says that I'm an AOSIS negotiator, actually I am a supporter of AOSIS negotiators while often in the room at the same time. I want to go back very far, almost 30 years, to Agenda 21, which, while it's a non-binding voluntary action plan for achieving sustainable development, but by the 21st century, it was negotiated and adopted by a vote by 178 countries. And of real relevance to small island developing states, Agenda 21 recognizes the special case of SIDS, small island developing states, both for environment and development. And I don't want to be positive, negative here, but potential downsides that are recognized for SIDS in respect of climate change are their ecologically fragile and vulnerable states, limited land area and small communities, the limited resources they have coupled with geographic dispersion, in particular in the Pacific Islands, and isolation from large markets. And Agenda 21 also recognizes that SIDS are extremely vulnerable to global warming and sea level rise, with certain small low-lying islands facing the increasing threat of the loss of their entire national territories. And this is not clearly not purely economic loss. This is loss of everything, which includes all of the non-economic losses that have been enumerated before during this panel discussion. The positive upsides, and I think this also chimes with the importance of indigenous knowledge and biodiversity, is that because of their geographic isolation, islands have a habitation, a comparatively large number of unique species of flora and fauna, giving them a very high share of global biodiversity. And we've seen how important biodiversity can be towards addressing climate change and its impacts. And each island has a rich and diverse culture with special adaptations to island environments and knowledge, indigenous knowledge of the sound management of island resources. So this special case of SIDS actually, in my view, really taps into a number of the issues that we've already been exploring as a result of this panel discussion. And I would like to just preface Agenda 21, 1992, that the Rio conference was where, and the run up to it was also where the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, was being negotiated as well. And so that these issues are around SIDS that were recognized in Agenda 21 certainly filtered into the negotiating process around the Climate Change Convention. So what I did, and thanks to Sandeep for already laying out this set of parameters for non-economic losses. This is a piece of a diagram that was put together by the UNFCCC Secretariat that is looking at and helping send out the message around NELs. And I wanted to try and map very briefly the Agenda 21 special case slide from the last slide with against these different aspects of non-economic losses. So for individuals, the small size of islands and their small population size is really critical. The death of one or two individuals as a result of an extreme weather event can potentially devastate an entire village or an entire community. And so small population sizes are really critical, in particular with those islands that still run communal law, tribal law type of practices, and so that human loss of life is critical to the well-being of these communities. The limited resources, certainly in terms of their ability to build back, as it were, their ability to deal with the health aspects of extreme events, and the no room to move, the limited land area, feeds into the terrible human mobility aspects that certainly Asfari brought out very eloquently in the last presentation. From a societal point of view, and I've touched on some of these, the rich and diverse cultures with special adaptations to island environments can certainly be completely wiped out in a day by a hurricane or a cyclone. And the knowledge of the sound management of island resources is also at risk. Colin mentioned cultural heritage. Most of island communities live on the coast, and when you have rising sea levels and other impacts from storms, you run the risk of losing not only your home, but the cemeteries and places where your ancestors have been living for many years. Environmentally, we've talked about the importance of biodiversity and ecology, the ecologically fragile and vulnerable state of islands is important when you consider what kinds of non-economic losses they might be facing, and as well as the uniqueness of that biodiversity and certainly the vulnerability of that biodiversity to global warming and sea level rise. So a very kind of quick and dirty mapping of Agenda 21 special case of SIDS across the categories of non-economic losses. I just wanted to provide you some examples of climate impacts that have led to or may lead to non-economic losses in SIDS. Certainly we have examples of extreme weather events. In 2017, there were two, Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, which hit two islands in various islands, but certainly SIDS in the Caribbean. In particular, Barbuda was hit very hard by Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Maria hit Dominica in a very big way. And then also a few years earlier, Fiji was hit by Cyclone Winston. And in 2020, right in the beginning of the pandemic lockdown in most of the world, Vanuatu was hit by Cyclone Harold, and actually getting aid and support to those in Vanuatu who were affected by Cyclone Harold was critically affected by the ability to travel, or the lack of the ability to travel as a result of the pandemic last year. I have economic losses and deaths associated with the different events. For example, there were 3 deaths in Antigua and Barbuda, $150 million of loss, which doesn't sound like a lot, but these are small islands with small economies. So 150 million for Antigua and Barbuda is a big loss. Dominica, 65 deaths, and these are perhaps regional numbers, but we're getting into the billions of damage. And not only that, but the rainfall in advance of Hurricane Maria caused severe landslides in Dominica, and which led to a number of deaths. So it's not just the event itself; it's the knock-on effects. And I could give you more numbers, but they're economic numbers, and they don't really incorporate the enormity of the non-economic losses that are associated with these extreme events. And I've been reading the Q&A, and I think that trying to get our hands around this valuation of non-economic losses is currently a big issue. Just to talk a little bit more about slow onset events, sea level rise, but also ocean acidification and others, permanent rises in temperatures. We have islands amongst the SIDS that are very low lying. Kiribati is 2 meters above sea level. Several islands in that island chain have already been inundated, and mobility and moving away from those home islands has been occurring. The Maldives is 1 meter above sea level. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is 2 meters above sea level. And certainly there's implications for these islands with sea level rise, but just an example of the Republic of the Marshall Islands is that as the sea level rises, natural periodic events such as king tides, etc., become far more vicious, and that the flooding and inundation of those islands is affected also by what were once very natural cyclical events. So what does this mean for island populations? And again, I think so much of this was already brought out in the previous presentations. Certainly there needs to be a significant amount of awareness raising that's required, and gathering not only awareness raising, and this has been brought out quite eloquently by other speakers, gathering information from island communities, because that's where the knowledge sits. Finding the right resources, the right scale to deal with the changes, building capacity to access those resources. It's not just finding the solutions, but it's allowing those being affected to access the solutions, overcoming the challenges with economies of scale. Islands have very small economies, not always very interesting for foreign investors, moving fast enough to make a difference. And I think the urgency of needing to deal with reducing greenhouse gas emissions really feeds into this whole set of concerns that we have. And ultimately, if all else fails, facilitating the movement of people, whether it's temporary or permanent, and dealing with all of the psychological impacts associated with that. Finally, and this I hope ties back into some of the questions, but also right back into Sandeep's initial presentation, where he laid out the international process very well. Non-economic losses have been recognized at the UNFCCC level. They are an essential part of the 5-year rolling work plan of the WIM XCOM. There is an expert group and plan of action which Sandeep walked us through. There was a question on reporting and visibility in the international process around non-economic losses, and I know that Sandeep already provided an answer, but here are where I see some of the entry points for recognizing non-economic losses in the international process. By including loss and damage and non-economic losses in nationally determined contributions, by putting loss and damage and non-economic losses in adaptation communications, whether it's through the NDC, through national adaptation plans, national communications, biennial transparency reports. There's a whole slew of reports under the process where these can come in. We were talking about markets versus non-markets. Article 6.8 looks at non-market approaches to dealing with raising ambition and implementing NDCs. And I believe that this is another entry point where regulatory frameworks, social safety nets, etc., fall under this set of non-market approaches. And so not to diminish the negotiations around Article 6 and focus just on the market aspect, there's a non-market approach coming into the process through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The global stock take will take a collective look at all this reporting, and certainly, and Pasang, wonderful to have you here. The local communities and indigenous peoples platform of the UNFCCC is definitely an entry point for dealing with NELs, and certainly NELs in SIDS. And finally, and this was also mentioned by almost everyone, I believe, there is a recognition of the need for international support, not just for island states, but for all vulnerable developing countries in respect of dealing with these non-economic losses that we are facing. That's a wrap for me. Thank you so much for your attention. And I, again, really feel privileged to be part of this amazing panel of individuals. And I'll turn it back to you, Colin. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was great to start it with a reminder of Agenda 21, 1992, the fact that 178 nations came together and recognized the global fragility, and especially for the small island developing states. It is a sober reminder that we have been talking about this for an awful long time, but we still don't see the actions that are necessary for this change that is so desperately needed. I think it was really great that you highlighted so many good examples from the small island developing states. I'll just pick a few of the key points I picked up. I mean, the fact that many of these, due to their small size, their limitations, their remoteness and isolation, means that these tropical storms, which are only getting worse as the atmosphere heats up, have such a massive impact, but also reminding us that it's not just the direct impact of the cyclone, but it's then the cascading impacts that follow on from that: pollution of water supplies, breakdown of infrastructure, destruction of crops, destruction of housing. It's not just we need to provide people with shelter and food in the immediate aftermath, but we also need to help them build back better. I think the point that you raised about, $150 million hit isn't a big hit for most countries, but for a small island developing state, that's a massive hit on its economy, and also that is also a potential put off for potential investors. Not only is the scale of the economy unattractive for traditional investments or market-based approaches, but also the exposure to these hazards means that that investors may worry about the returns on investment. I think you also highlighted clearly the implications for small island developing states now being 1 meter, 2 meters above sea level, how that is changing what were once just normal, regular cyclic events. The king tides have now become highly destructive. And I particularly appreciated your reminder, Linda, that we need to highlight the importance of non-economic losses in the NDCs, in the national adaptation plans, in national communications, the biannual transparency report, because if we don't talk about these things, if we don't highlight the importance of these things, they tend to get forgotten. So thank you very much for the presenters. We've now got approximately 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So if I could ask you all to put your cameras on, please. And while you're doing that, a big thank you to the audience for your great questions. And please do keep your questions coming. Now, I am struggling to keep up with the questions and manage my screen. but so please bear with me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask three questions that I've taken from the Q&A box to the panel, and I'll ask the panel to reflect on those, and then I'll scan through the Q&A box. So please do keep your questions coming. So first of all, we've got a question here from Demet Intepe, and she's asking what can be done to amplify local voices and narratives regarding NELs at the COP26 to counterbalance the existing frameworks of measurement and valuation. There was also a question from Nusrat Chowdhury. She reminded us that at least 6 cyclones have hit Bangladesh since Cyclone Sidr, and we're unable to talk about the irreversible ecosystem and biodiversity related losses and damages of those disasters. Do you think having data is one of the major barriers to even start having a discussion on NELs? So I'll leave the panel with those 2 questions. I will go back to the Q&A box now and pick up the questions for the next round. So who would like to take that first question, which is how to amplify local voices and narratives? Okay.
Can I?
Go ahead,
Can I, Colin?
sorry.
Yeah, thank you for this important question. This is really important that the local voices reach to the people who are at the level of the policy making, who are at the level of making the decision on the investment or spending at the local level. It is very important that these people heard that what impact these community people are facing and what needs to be done there. And for that, one of the solution is that they at the local level there is enough allocation has been channeled so that local government institutions and the community together can plan that how can they really deal with these particular situations and also protect their natural assets. And as we know that one of the solutions these days we are talking a lot, that is nature-based solutions. So it is very important to actually see that what kind of solutions we can really offer to these communities so that really they can stay in the places where they are now, but at the same time they have the economic opportunities to work on. And for the displacement, certainly there are a lot of things that should be done from the national level, and the voices certainly should go from the local level. I'll stop here.
I'm sorry. Sandeep, would you like to come in?
Sure. I think thanks for the question. What I see there are, building on what Afsari said, I see there are 2 things that can be done. One at the local or the national level, where the local voice really needs to be drumbeat, whether at the national level in all relevant stakeholder consultation and everything, and also highlight the importance of the NEL in all the national level planning processes. Either we're talking about the NDCs, or either we're talking about the NAVs, or either we're talking about the NATCOM or national communication. But also in the meantime, it is also equally important to raise the voice, not only at the national level, but also at the international level, especially in the UNFCCC process as a civil society, to look the issue of NEL as a comprehensive approach, and what kind of support that can be delivered through the UNFCCC process. So there is 2 ways: focusing on the national level and also highlighting and educating your national delegates that if they have missed those elements, but also meantime working with the international community like us and others, there are various civil society and groups, in terms of raising your voice at the international platform and highlighting this particular issue from a civil society perspective, not only from the government perspective. So there are 2 ways that can be done: lobby at the national focal points and other things, and at the meantime engage with the other larger civil society who are beyond the national boundary, and to raise the voice at the international platform. Over.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. Would anybody else like to come up with any other suggestions around how to amplify local voices and narratives, or should we move on to the question about, is this lack of data inhibiting our ability to start having a productive and constructive discussion around NELs? Hassan, yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, for highlighting this part. I would like to highlight the importance of the disaggregated data here now, because the values of the local, especially on the local, the indigenous peoples or local community or women's or youth importance for resilience of the climate change not been explicitly covered in the discourse of climate change, either at the national or the global level, is because of the absence of the disaggregated data. So if you see all the national climate framework that, as Linda has already mentioned, that LCIP one, LCIP, I was the former co-chair of the LCIP. And I'm also representing the Asia at the moment and working very hard. How can we bring up this disaggregated data, the role and contribution of indigenous people and local communities that has contributed for the climate change resilience? We have worked in 12 activities, and in our survey done by the UNCCC Secretariat with the FWG clearly shows that indigenous peoples and local communities engagement in the national climate change discourse is very, very low. And then also, like if you talk about the national adaptation plan, or if you talk about the NDC, national determined contribution, that has already been like almost 7-8 countries have already submitted, even the second one including Nepal. All the data that the formulated is based on the secondary data. So in the secondary data, how can you see the role and contribution of the local knowledge or local value system in the secondary data? Because so far all the data are guided from our, like a more kind of a top-down approach, more kind of Western values or modern values, or more kind of capitalistic worldviews. The indigenous worldviews, the local worldviews are hardly considered in the secondary data. So this is the time that we deal with our primary data or the disaggregated data, so that our policymakers, our state parties be aware the important role and contribution played by the indigenous people and local communities and women, youth, on the ground. So that part, and that part I do not just want to say from my own experience, but also from the survey done by the LCIP of the UNCCC recently done in 197 countries. The data shows that one, the lab. To fulfill that gap, we have been working on the layers of the dialogue to be organized in a COP26. I'm also co-leading different activities of the FWG, including the policy advocacy, multi-stakeholder dialogue, and also the discussion with the policy levels, and also the Action Climate Empowerment constituent bodies of the UNCCC and FWG were working on the knowledge system, developing our education system that to be reflected in formal, non-formal education, so that our children start learning the local values, knowledge values, so that the future generations already aware and balance the science knowledge with the local knowledge. I will come up if there is more queries. I see a lot of questions, but maybe I'll stop for the moment.
Yeah, Pasang, thank you very much. Just to note, there are a few questions specifically to you about clarifying data, which I hope we can follow up after. So does anybody else have any thoughts on Nusrat's question about lack of data and how we can overcome that? Yes, Linda, go ahead.
Thank you, and I want to give as much time to answer other questions, but certainly for islands, it's not just about the quantity of data, it's the quality of the data. And so I'm looking more at the secondary data that Pasang was talking about, that the level of the scale of the data, a lot of the data that's collected from, global weather stations, et cetera, isn't small enough to actually get to one small island. And so that the data could encompass, one data point can encompass your entire island. And so that it's the scale of the data that's also really critical for small island developing states. And I've been around in the process for a very long time, and we started looking at the negotiations that led to the Warsaw International Mechanism, and the first issue in 2012 that we looked at was around data. And so we're 9 years on, we're still grappling with the data question. And I appreciate that this is about non-economic losses, but in the broader picture of loss and damage, data has been an issue for a very long time. Thank you.
Very much, Linda, for those key reminders. Sari, go ahead.
I'll just say a few words as university students in the UK. I think when we were looking through the literature reports that are available on non-economic loss, just very little. And actually, for most of the time writing a report, it was really hard to choose a case study because there's very disaggregated data. And of course, coming together and putting this into a whole narrative is one of the biggest challenges on top of the data availability. So I find that there's also the need to get data and do the research, but also the urgency of addressing what's really happening now. So I think there's a balance between, just acting upon what we already know and then really doing academic research as well. As scholars ourselves, we always, are challenged with the need to publish, but what's more important is actually going on the ground and acting and implementing the things that we are seeing already. So yeah, just a little thought to add.
Thank you very much, Sari. We've got a few minutes left, so I think we've got a very good final question from Sindra Sharma. She asks, how can developed economies build trust on the issue of loss and damage and non-economic losses within this important year of climate action? It seems unlikely that they will extend new and additional finance for loss and damage, and the focus on insurance is alienating. So would anybody like to have a go at answering that question?
I will wait to answer the question for me. I'll wait for
Okay,
that.
Thank you, Pasang. So Sandeep, quickly, go ahead.
Yeah, Colin, I'll just give it a try. Definitely on loss and damage finance is one of the critical, I would say, and a very highly political debate, as we all know, and really hard to break through how that can be done. But there is also a lot of efforts ongoing, especially by the UK presidency, in terms of how to take this issue forward, especially in the light of the ongoing loss and damage issue. But one of the things, it's my own personal belief, if we really, it's not about bringing loss and damage as equivalent to a compensation, but more looking the loss and damage from a solidarity point of view, if that makes a case, and if those angle can be pushed to the developed country, then and I hope there might be some breakthrough. But if there's also a hard line between the loss and damage is a compensation issue, that what we did on the let's say in the Doha COP and in Warsaw COP, because we need to progress on that part. So that may be a deadlock, but that's my own personal feeling. But this is one of the, it's not a technical issue, it's more as a political issue when we talk about the loss and damage finance. So that needs to be understood. So that needs to be dealt at the political level, and politically this needs to be resolved. And I see this more as a political issue rather than a technical issue. So we need to look the loss and damage finance from a solidarity point of view, not from a compensation or liability point of view. And one thing for sure, I think the insurance is really pulling this little bit apart. I think that's fair enough. Insurance do have a role to play, but the insurance will not really fulfill all the scope and area of loss and damage or addressing loss and damage. So these are my few points. And just to kick us started discussion, Colin.
Thank you, Sandeep. I mean, I think 2 points to reflect on that. I think the issue around compensation is it's not okay when we're talking about loss and damage, but it is okay within the UNFCCC when we're talking about investors investing in mitigation projects that don't turn out as predicted. So compensation within the UNFCCC is perfectly okay in certain contexts, but not in the loss and damage context. And then I think on the insurance one, yes, insurance is a part of the puzzle, but are we seeing a parallel shift to think about social protection and investing in contingency funds? No, we're seeing investments in insurance. So I think within the UNFCCC, we need to call out these inabilities to have a one size fits all approach to all of the issues. And if compensation is not allowed to be discussed, then it shouldn't be allowed to be discussed in the case of investors investing in mitigation projects, for example. So Pasang, you said you'd like to come back on one of the questions. So could you just indicate the question and the questioner, and then thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have already noted down the questions that has been posted in the Q&A and also the chat box by Sunilji. Okay, so the first I've been asked like the statements between the indigenous people and the biodiversity. The research study, if you see the ICBASE 2019 report, if you could just Google, you could find it out. Yeah, ICBASE 2019 report, also IPMG 2020, or IUCN 2019, or World Bank's. You can come up with different layers of the fact that, I did not say earlier, but one thing I would like to add further on this one, that 10% of the indigenous people's land territory has been legally acknowledged. So land tenure security of the 6.2 indigenous people world population is already legally recognized. And that is also considered on the fact that 6.2% with the recognition of 10% of the land territory contributed for 1/4 of the global lands, contributing 80% of the biodiversity. So this is the fact that already been come up with the report. So considering this important report also shows that how important the indigenous people's role and contribution, and especially through the knowledge system, the cultural, the traditional values, the spiritual values. So that's all things are counted there. Counted there. So and then also the RRI report on this one counted or counteract that, in Asia, 1.5% of the indigenous people's land territory are legally recognized. So, billions of people, indigenous people here, if you acknowledge more, like, for example, out of 6.2% of the global population, 70% of the indigenous peoples are in Asia. So out of 75% in Asia, almost 35% in Nepal. So just imagine, like, the role and contribution, if you acknowledge their land tenure security, their customary governance system, how much they could contribute for the, natural governance and contribution for the biodiversity. We can just think about it. So that part. Then another part is like, as you have mentioned, how could we highlight the synergy between the biodiversity loss and the nature-based solution? The only one short question would be respecting, securing the rights and safeguards of indigenous people and local communities. I think ways is there. So third question, because we do not have time, I could not elaborate more, but I will just give you short, and if needed, we can have, if time allows, I would be happy to, describe in detail. Then another part, how can the international leaders recognize the importance of traditional knowledge? That is, as I said, also touched upon in my presentation, that in 2015 in COP21 in Paris, for the first time in the history, after the struggle of indigenous peoples in 25 years since 1992, for the first time acknowledge the indigenous people knowledge and value system through the establishment of the local communities and indigenous people platform. This platform is not established just only because the UNFCCC secretary wanted. No, there are a lot of struggle, there are blood and tears of the indigenous people throughout the history that they craved for, they really struggle for securing their rights and securing advocating, and also to assurance for the indigenous people's issues and knowledge system, especially culture and values that contributed for climate change, and that to be part of the discussion in the UNCCC. So I would like to request all of you, like, if you are interested to see like how the indigenous knowledge system to be part of the global discussion, please follow LC, because that is going to be also, we have a couple of, as I highlighted already, I'm also leading a couple of the activities in FCIP on behalf of the FWG. Please do follow the COP26 on LC. The third one, how can we assure the first solution, such as the poor carbon offsetting credits to be not received? So this is how could we ensure the first solution? Because this is because how could we ensure? Because as we already discussed, building the capacity, awareness level on the local ground, local emphasis is hardly been given, no? So all the talks is all floating on the global level. So that talks to be replicated at the national and the local level. And if the local levels speak out with their clear voice, I think no one can stop. With this one, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pasang. That was excellent. I think we've had a really productive, a really rich set of presentations and an excellent discussion. I'm sorry, but the time is up now. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers. So Sandeep, Quincy and Sari, Pasang, Afsari and Linda, thank you for your excellent presentations and your contribution to our session today. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us and your excellent questions. We will certainly be putting the recording of this session online and sharing the link with all of the people who registered for the event afterwards. And yeah, it's just an honor for me to say thank you everybody for a great session. And yeah, we will be in touch with the link to the video, the recording, and follow up with some of the excellent questions one-to-one later. So thank you very much, everybody. Big round of applause and goodbye.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.